Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Science of Mom, a research-based guide to your baby's first year, 2nd edition, by Alice Callahan, narrated by Joana Garcia. Publisher's note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to graphs present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Preface. I write this today having just finished months of editing and updating this book for the 2nd edition. This was a process of sifting through the research published in the past 6 or 7 years to ensure that the science in this book is up to date, and because science is always moving us forward. That meant reading hundreds more papers. I shouldn't have been surprised, but I found much more new science to incorporate than I had anticipated. Updating this book also meant poring over the words I wrote as many years ago and letting them draw me back to the questions of new parenthood, remembering all the worry and wonder of that time. C, my first child, recently celebrated her 10th birthday, which means I've closed out my first decade as a parent. Max, my second and last child, started kindergarten this fall, albeit from home, as we're in the midst of a global pandemic. It feels like the end of an era. I'm glad to have this book as part of the record of my children's first years and my early years as a parent, and for the opportunity to ensure it continues to be a current and relevant resource for today's new parents. The COVID-19 pandemic has turned our lives upside down in a year also marked by tumultuous politics, a long overdue reckoning with systemic racism, and terrifying wildfires, which enveloped my town in smoke last month as the forests we love burned. Some days, it was difficult to focus on the research and writing required to update this book. What motivated me to sit down with it each day were the memories of those early days and nights of parenthood, the fatigue of constant caregiving, the anxiety that we might be doing it all wrong, and the late-night internet searching for answers, or at least some reassurance. Even in the best, most normal of times, although I'm not sure what normal means anymore, parenting is hard. However, it can also infuse your life with sweetness and give you hope for the future. My sincere wish is that this book can relieve some of your mental load, the worries and questions of new parenthood, and tip your balance toward enjoying the sweetness of a new baby. I believe now more than ever that science can be a light that leads us forward. I'm counting on it to lead us out of this pandemic and to help us solve the climate crisis, but also to shed a little light on the everyday tasks of raising children. For although much has changed over the last decade, my trust in science has not. Introduction. I was a scientist first. I started working in research labs as a college student, then as a lab technician, and then went on to graduate school for a PhD in nutritional biology. By the time my husband and I decided we were ready for a baby, I was a postdoctoral fellow studying fetal physiology. For the previous decade of my life, I had been working to understand the world through the lens of science. I asked questions and sought answers by designing and conducting experiments in the lab. I pored over journal articles, trying to make sense of my data and figure out what important questions to ask next. My job was to measure, analyze, and explain. If I felt lost, then the way out of darkness was always to learn more. Maybe by repeating an experiment or immersing myself in the scientific literature until things started to look a little clearer. It should come as no surprise, then, that when I didn't get pregnant in the first couple of months of trying, I tackled it in the best way I knew how, with science. I measured my basal body temperature and tracked my cervical mucus. I recorded my bodily data in a spreadsheet and searched for patterns in color-coded graphs. I pulled out my reproductive physiology textbook to brush up on ovulation and how to optimize our chances at fertilization. It's hard to say whether any of this helped me to get pregnant any faster, but it did at least give me a feeling of control, though perhaps at the expense of romance. When I eventually did get pregnant and became a mother, this same story played out again and again with different details. Pregnancy and childbirth were just the beginning. Caring for my first child, C, brought lots more questions. Where should she sleep? And when could I expect her to sleep through the night? When should she start solid foods, and what should I feed her? Should I be worried about vaccine safety? Between feeding and rocking, changing and bouncing, and soothing and singing, I found myself digging into the science of parenting. At about the same time, I left the research lab so that I could spend more time with C and explore other career paths. But I missed talking about science with like-minded colleagues. I started the Science of Mom blog as a place to share and discuss what I was learning about parenting. And I was thrilled to find a community of equally inquisitive parents looking for solid science. My blog readers were fascinated by the complexities of the science and always ready with new questions, which inspired me to keep researching and writing. At some point, I wanted to be able to develop these topics in a more cohesive manner, and that journey became this book. Why do we look to science for answers to parenting questions? For most of human history, how we cared for our babies was passed quietly from generation to generation, one mother to the next. It varied around the world, and it changed over time, but it was informed by culture, environment, and necessity, not science. But for our generation, new parenthood means making a huge number of decisions with little familial or cultural guidance. Most of us live far away from the parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles, and brothers and sisters who might have guided us into parenthood in generations past. Instead, we have unlimited advice from the Internet, a resource that empowers us to find our own answers, but at the same time overwhelms us with confusing information. If our babies won't nap or we're struggling with breastfeeding, we can ask Google for answers or solicit opinions from our vast networks on social media. Very quickly, we find ourselves in a minefield of conflicting information and opinions, often paired with a little judgment from all sides. Science is a tool that can help us get closer to the truth in the midst of all this confusion. It can help us to sidestep the opinions and philosophies and anecdotes that fuel parenting debates. We look to science not to confirm what we want to believe or to prove others wrong, but rather to make the best decisions we can as parents. It isn't that science has all the answers. For some parenting questions, like those that are medical in nature, science can be a great guide. For others, like parenting practices, it can often only give us clues, and then we have to figure out how they might or might not apply to our own families. The truth is, from a scientific standpoint, parenting is an immensely complicated thing to study. How do we sort through and quantify so many variables, along with all the differences between babies and families, and, statistically, make some sense of it all? Something so complex can rarely be reduced to a right way or a wrong way. What science can do is zoom out to look at large numbers of babies and families to reveal patterns and averages and ranges of normal. It can give us a broader perspective that can be hard to find during the day-to-day tasks of caring for a baby. It can reveal risks and benefits that we may not have considered, allowing us to approach decisions in an objective way. Science may not offer a protocol for parenting, like the procedures that I perfected in my research lab, but it can help us make smart decisions for our families. Science can also help us rise above parenting controversies. In many cases, if you carefully study the data, as I did in my research for this book, you see that there's rarely a strong case for everyone doing things in the same way. There's plenty of room for parents to make different choices about how their baby eats and sleeps, for example. When you understand the limitations of the science, you are empowered to follow your heart and your child's lead. And in cases where the science gives us a clearer answer, it can help us make decisions more confidently. We don't have to waste our energy arguing or defending ourselves because we've looked at the evidence and we're comfortable with our choices. This frees up valuable time and energy to focus on our babies, do the work or hobbies that bring us fulfillment and satisfaction, or even take a much-needed nap. I begin this book in Chapter 1 with a sort of crash course in evidence-based parenting. If we want to examine parenting decisions in a scientific way, then we must first understand how science works, how to parse through many studies to find the most relevant ones, and how to interpret research in a meaningful way. Chapter 1 will give you an idea of how I approached each topic in this book, and it should also prepare you to tackle your own questions with science as your guide. In Chapters 2 and 3, I zoom in on a few medical questions important to newborn babies, including when we should cut the umbilical cord, whether babies born by cesarean should be seeded with their mother's microbes, when and how they should receive their first bath, and why they get an injection of vitamin K and a smear of antibiotics in their eyes. These may be small questions in the scheme of a baby's first year of life, but they each provide a fascinating case study in the history and science of newborn medicine. In Chapter 4, I step away from decision-making and appreciate new babies as scientists do, for their incredible abilities to sense and explore their own world with touch, sound, sight, and smell. Understanding our newborns sets the stage for how we care for them responsively and how the parent-child relationship develops over time. In the rest of the book, I examine some of the biggest questions and sources of angst for parents. Vaccine safety, Chapter 5. Sleep safety and bed sharing, Chapter 6. Baby sleep patterns, Chapter 7. Breast milk and formula feeding, Chapter 8. Starting solid foods, Chapter 9. And healthy nutrition for the older baby, Chapter 10. As I researched and wrote each chapter of the book, I read hundreds of scientific papers, talked to scientists, and interviewed parents about their experiences. I looked for answers, but I also wasn't afraid to investigate and question the parts of science where things are still uncertain, and that is often where I found some of the most interesting stories. I didn't write this book pretending to be a parenting expert. I wrote it as a parent with questions, probably similar to your own, and I had the scientific training and the curiosity to dig for the answers. I didn't set out to argue one side or the other on controversial topics. Instead, I've tried to be honest about what the science does and doesn't tell us, even when that might be different from the simplified recommendations handed down to us from parenting authority figures. I loved delving into labyrinthine literature searches, trying to find some kind of truth that could be useful to you and me. Thanks for coming along on this journey with me. I hope it makes your job as a parent a little easier and maybe more interesting, too. Chapter 1. Show Me the Science, a crash course in evidence-based parenting. Until I became pregnant, my science life and my home life rarely converged. I spent long hours conducting experiments in the lab and reading and writing scientific papers in my office and at my kitchen table. But for the most part, when my work was done for the day, I set the science aside. I saw the scientific process as a way for me to understand my little corner of research, not as a helpful tool in making everyday decisions. If I had a question about gardening, cooking, or training our dog, I'd do a quick internet search and read advice from a few different sites. But I had neither the time nor the inclination to dive into the scientific literature for answers. All of that changed when I became pregnant. Suddenly, I had a lot of questions, and these felt more important than any I'd previously faced. I realized that, as a parent, I was tasked with the responsibility of making decisions for another person, and I wanted to get this right. I needed to figure out what chemicals and procedures in my research lab might pose a health risk to me or my baby. I wanted to eat well and exercise appropriately for an optimal pregnancy, and plan and prepare for birth in the same detail-oriented way that I mapped out a protocol in the lab. And science, I recognized, was a tool that could help me do all this. Best of all, I knew how to use it. As a scientist, surely I could make this an evidence-based pregnancy and an evidence-based baby. Good data could soothe my anxieties and insecurities about becoming a parent. If only it was that simple. Science did help me to make some decisions, and that's what this book is all about. But I also found that the reality often deviated from the plan. No amount of planning could prepare me for how a labor contraction would feel as it screamed through my body, or for how I could cope when my baby had been up for hours needing me in the middle of the night. I learned that part of parenting is accepting that it usually won't go as planned and that we can't control every variable. We have to learn as we go. We adjust and adapt and then go back to the science with new questions, wanting to learn more. Many of the areas of research that I investigated for this book were much more complex than any scientific question I had tackled before. I was accustomed to studying lab animals or isolated cells grown in a test tube or a petri dish, where I could control nearly every variable, tweaking the one in question to determine its importance or to get my experimental conditions just right. But parenting questions have so many more variables. For example, most of us at some point wonder how we can help our babies to sleep better at night. How can we answer that with science? We can't put babies in a laboratory and control every variable that might affect their sleep. Babies are born to different parents who have different philosophies and cultural traditions that they carry with them into parenting. Our homes are different, with varying amounts of light, noise, and activity. And of course, the babies themselves are different, born with their own unique personalities and needs. Even if we could control these variables, Would we want to? I don't think so. Human variation is part of what makes life beautiful. All this natural variation between babies and families makes parenting research difficult to do and even harder to interpret. A major task of science is to describe variation quantitatively and then try to understand the patterns that emerge from the data. With enough data points and studies, we can see which patterns are consistent and repeatable, and we can start to tease out truths that can help us make sense of the everyday challenges of parenting, like how to help a baby sleep well at night. But taking an evidence-based approach to parenting also means being aware of the limitations of science and approaching the data with curiosity and skepticism. We need to be able to find relevant studies, judge their quality, interpret their results, and then figure out whether they can inform our own approaches to parenting. Science can be such a valuable tool, but only if we understand how it works. In this book, I explore what I think are some of the most interesting parenting decisions in a baby's first year. But it isn't a complete guide, and it won't answer all your questions by any means. However, my hope is that this book will give you the tools you need to search the science for your own answers. To help you understand my approach to interpreting science for this book and how you can apply it yourself, let's walk through some of the most important concepts for understanding science. 1. Science is a process. The scientific method allows us to observe the world in a systematic, objective way. It is simple enough that children begin practicing it in elementary school, if not sooner. I have fond memories of conducting science fair experiments and preparing my trifold poster displays with big, stenciled letters for each of the major steps: question, hypothesis, prediction, experimental method, analysis, and conclusion. Not so different from the headings I used when I wrote journal articles years later. We now know that even babies and toddlers practice their own version of the scientific method as they make observations about the world, form their own predictions, and test them in experiments. The scientific method is a simple framework for inquiry, and it is exactly this simplicity that makes it so valuable. It means that other scientists can repeat the experiment to verify the results, or change one or two variables to determine how they affect the outcomes. What makes it meaningful is that we all use the same process, and over time it helps us to better understand the world. Good science takes lots of experiments, repeated, checked and challenged over and over, time and people with diverse perspectives and backgrounds to build a body of knowledge. But it always starts in the same place, with a question and the desire to answer it. 2. Good science is peer-reviewed. A critical part of the scientific process is peer review and publication of results. Even the most exciting research is essentially meaningless if it exists only in lab notebooks or in digital files stored at the lab server. Publication is a permanent record of scientific discovery. To be considered credible and to add to scientific knowledge, studies need to be published so that other researchers can check the work and build on it. When scientists are ready to publish their results, they write them up in the form of a research paper and then submit it to a scientific journal. Journals, especially the best ones, receive many more papers than they publish, and they're selective about what they accept. If the editor thinks a paper could be a good fit for the journal, it will be subjected to peer review. This means that several experts in that specific area of research will read and critique the paper. They'll check to see whether the researchers used appropriate experimental and statistical methods to test the hypothesis, or whether the interpretation of the results is reasonable. Peer reviewers aren't paid to do this job, but they take the responsibility seriously, knowing that the legitimacy of their field of research rests on good peer review. They're also usually anonymous, so they can freely offer their opinions and concerns without fear of damage in relationships with other scientists. The peer review system is a quality control filter for science. It's designed to catch and reject papers that don't meet certain standards, although this means they're often resubmitted to a lower quality journal. For those that do meet standards of publication for the journal, peer review often increases the quality of research before it's published. Peer reviewers may ask authors to collect more data, analyze it in a different way, or consider alternative explanations for the results. The purpose of peer review is to keep everyone honest and to keep the standards of scientific publication high. So, if you're looking to science for answers to your parenting questions, be sure you're looking at peer-reviewed science. Most papers published in scientific journals are peer-reviewed, but you can check journal web pages to be sure. Letters to the editor and commentaries published in journals aren't usually peer-reviewed, although they can make for interesting reading. Most books are not peer-reviewed, except those published by university presses, including this one, which usually have a formal peer review process. Nonprofit organizations and for-profit companies sometimes publish reports or white papers that are intentionally made to look like scientific papers, but they're most likely not peer-reviewed. They may or may not be based on solid science, but they're almost certainly published because they fit a narrative that benefits the organization or company. So approach them with a healthy dose of skepticism. 3. One study is never all that meaningful on its own. What matters is scientific consensus. Scientific knowledge has to start somewhere, but one study is never worth much on its own, even after peer review. Scientists can and do make mistakes, use flawed methodology, or simply misinterpret their data. So, we like to see studies repeated and hypotheses tested in different ways before we get too excited about results. For an example of the pitfalls of putting too much weight on one study, look no further than Andrew Wakefield's 1998 paper attempting to link the measles, mumps, and rubella (MMR) vaccine to autism. Wakefield's study used methodology that was weak and ethically problematic, and it didn't even provide evidence that MMR caused autism. Somehow, it got through the standard process of review by some of his peers and was published in The Lancet, a prestigious medical journal. After the problems with Wakefield's paper came to light, The Lancet retracted it in 2010, essentially removing it from the archives of reputable science. And the story didn't end there. Wakefield's hypothesis was investigated by many more scientists, looking at it from different angles and using better methods, and the results haven't supported any link between the MMR vaccine and autism. We now have a huge amount of science showing that Wakefield was wrong. More details on this story can be found in Appendix D. Wakefield's MMR study is a dramatic example. It reached an unusual level of infamy because it damaged public trust in vaccines, and the article had so many problems that it was eventually retracted. The journal's way of disowning the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?